name. And hello to this potentially international audience. Fantastic. So I am Damon Reed. I'm a pediatric oncologist, and we're going to talk about a little bit of epidemiology, a little bit of genetics, and a lot of clinical trials. We'll go through this in a couple slides. So adolescent and young adult oncology is the middle. When I was deciding after medical school what to do, you decided if you wanted to do pediatrics or if you wanted to do adult medicine. And then after doing that, you decide if you want to do cancer as a subspecialty. But you've already made that decision. You're going to take care of kids, you're going to take care of adults. And when you take care of kids, there's a cap, right? That cap might be 18 at the institution you train at, it might be 21. And it might be a little bit looser than that, but there's generally a cap, an oldest cap. Or you study adult medicine, and there's a overwhelming amount of older people with cancer. But about 7% of people that get cancer are in their 20s or 30s. And that gap wasn't addressed very well about 2 decades ago when I was in medical school. And there's been a national effort through the National Institutes of Health to try to address this adolescent and young adult gap. I want to applaud Brenda for this peer idea, because one of the things that got me into adolescent and young adult medicine, one of the things that I think is the most true, is that someone famous in the AYA field said, the best thing you can give an adolescent or young adult with cancer is another young adult or adolescent or young adult with cancer to talk to. And so peers are important at that age, of course. And as much as us in the medical field want to help, sometimes you just need someone else who's going through that same event to be like you mentioned, a mentor, friend, all of those sorts of things. So the adolescent and young adult field is fundamentally different. I don't think anyone feels like when they were 25, they were the same as when they were a child. I don't think that they would anticipate that they'd be the same as when they were a grandparent either. So it's a different kind of set of interests. The AYA field started over acute lymphoblastic leukemia, or I would say at least this is where the charge was. Pediatric oncologists saying, we do a better job of treating leukemia than older people, than older doctors that take care of older people. And so it was set up as a bit of an adversarial area. And titles of articles like What Adult Cancer Can Learn from Pediatrics come out. And it didn't set up a perfect field. That was my hesitation into getting into AYA, because I abhor confrontation. And so what we have done, and what I have done, is I'm a pediatric oncologist, but I work at Moffitt. Moffitt takes care of mostly older adults over the age of 18, with the exception of things like today's Pediatrics Day, with the exception of all kinds of individual cases that come sprinkling in throughout the year that older adult oncologists, not older in age, but people who primarily take care of adults, like Dr. Sondak, rally around these unusual or younger patients to try to figure out what we could do and what kind of expertise we can bring to them. So I'm a pediatric oncologist who has jumped freely into the adult world, and I believe that there are tons of areas in adolescent and young adult oncology where the pediatrician can learn from the adult oncologist. And melanoma is clearly that. So let's get into a little bit of the epidemiology. So up on the top are 15 to 39-year-olds diagnosed with melanoma. 0 to 14 is below that. Do you think we could learn more from 26,000 people or from 600 people? And so, without a doubt, there's just going to be, from the scientific method, randomize people to one thing or the other, figure out which was better. You're going to be able to do that faster in the adult world than you are in the pediatric world. And we'll go through some specific examples of that as well. Cancer is more common the older you get, and that counts when you're 20s and 30s. Way more common in 20s and 30s than it is in pediatrics. And melanoma is relatively more common in those kind of things. And so again, let the adults go on these trials. They're going to anyway, there's more of them. And then see what we can learn and bring it to pediatrics. I'll stay away from this right now because Dr. Messina is going to do a much better job. I think everyone in the room who's familiar with melanoma understands that melanoma in adults is melanoma, or it's not. But in pediatrics, there's shades of melanoma, and I think she's going to get into more detail. What I'll talk about today is just melanoma, the unequivocal melanoma in children. And when people have looked at that, when they've done genetics, and they've sequenced all 3 billion C's, T's, and A's, and G's in the DNA in every single cell, genetically, true melanoma in children is genetically similar to true melanoma in adults. This is the final result. So this was all the individual mutations. Each one of these boxes is individual mutations in genes. Genes listed here, patients listed in columns. Don't need to get into the details. Things like BRAF and other things that you've heard of are there in children just like they are in adults. And then also looking at copy numbers. So not the specific changes, but how things are elevated or taken away. And this also, adult medicine on top, pediatrics on the bottom. This is all the genes all the way across the whole cells again. The peaks and valleys kind of match again. And so the conclusion was there are many similarities. I highlighted the word similarities. Although these patients, the pediatric patients, have been almost uniformly excluded from the trials up front. So the latest and greatest, the trial that's going to come out tomorrow, I don't know what it is, just the theoretical trial, right now won't include 1-year-olds, won't include 2-year-olds. So that is a bit of a quandary. And so I was asked for the pediatrician's perspective on this, and it's complicated. When you look at something like ipilimumab, the first change over this last decade, right? Melanoma 20 years ago when I was in medical school was, I don't know, it was not exactly that super interesting because there wasn't a lot of stuff going on because although there might have been trials going on, they weren't wildly successful. Over the last 10 years, the trials have been wildly successful, right? Melanoma is the poster child for what's right in oncology. All kinds of approvals, at least a half a dozen drugs FDA approved now. Things that were incurable are now curable. I get no credit for that. That's the adult doctors doing adult trials. And one of the early ones, I just pulled this early one, was ipilimumab in patients with metastatic melanoma. Published in 2008, 60 patients went on every year. Took about a year and a half to accrue the trial fully, another half a year or so, another year for the patients to be followed and to find out that ipilimumab was a winner. It's fantastic. This was a phase 1 trial, finding the safe dose, and phase 2, trying to see with the signal. Again, maybe a year and a half to do it, another year to figure out the results. 2.5 years, 60 plus patients on, and published within a couple years. Ipilimumab in adolescents with unresectable, same population. This was about 4 patients a year, less than 4. It's actually about 3.6 patients on a year. Open in 90% of the sites that they planned. There was 10 sites. I believe it was December of 2013. Went 4 years to try to get the patients, and then ultimately had to close before they filled up. Ipilimumab was the standard of care almost a decade ago, give or take a couple of years. Vern could correct me if I'm wrong. Ipilimumab's trial was published in 2017 in adolescents, and it was an underpowered trial. It was a study that was a little bit, it wasn't filled up. What did they find? Similar activity, similar safety profile as that is seen in adults. So it's a little bit of I'm a card-carrying pediatric oncologist. I'm supposed to say the standard of care is always a trial, always a trial, always a trial. But in this case, we had this particular study open here for some period of time, but at a certain point, it didn't become the standard of care anymore. And at that point, we had to wheel one of the sites that had to bow out and say, sorry, we don't believe that this, even though this is a clinical trial, this clinical trial is with ipilimumab, and the field has moved past ipilimumab by itself, and we need to think about the standard of care has changed. And so the epidemiology matters. 26,000 is more than 600. There's only so many patients, and the field is changing so rapidly that we have to think about every single specific patient and find out what the right way to go is. This is a whole table that we assembled on another thing, but basically it's the same story over and over again. The melanoma patients can't help but think, boy, every single trial has been positive this last decade. Let's go on a trial. Trials are accruing at an incredible rate, and the field is changing at an incredible rate. And that's all that table was meant to show. We published in 2015 this existential crisis that we were having. What is the right care for an adolescent with young adult with adolescents specifically, teenagers, kids? This is a pediatric symposium. What is the right care? Is it the trial, or is it the standard of care in adults? And so we think moving forward, and this has happened, so this is the good news. Since 2015, the lower limits of trials in adults are not 18, largely now. Some of the cooperative group studies that go down to 12. The FDA has guidance saying it's puberty that matters, not a number. And so any patient over 12 is now considered to be an adult, at least from the FDA. So they've really kind of encouraged companies, and when the FDA encourages, that means they mandate, but that's just the polite word. But when the FDA says you should probably go down to 12, companies go down to 12. So trials are more open to taking teenagers, which is good. And we also called for, although this has not happened, age-specific analyses for efficacy and toxicity. So I don't know the truth as to whether or not 20-year-olds respond as well to ipilimumab or pembrolizumab or nivolumab or all these agents that are approved now as the older adults do. But that's something that I think people are going to look into. Burn leads a program that is very active and interested in taking care of younger patients. We did a little bit of just due diligence to make sure and see how that happened, how that may have helped our adolescent and young adult patients here. So we had led with the hypothesis that younger adults and adolescents don't typically go on trials very often. They're the lowest group for clinical trial participation. There's many reasons for that, but one of the reasons is they don't come to academic centers like this and have access to those trials. So we looked at our rate of young adults here at Moffitt, and we looked at, there's been a lot of young adults, over 1,800 patients between the age of 15 and 39 have been seen here at Moffitt over time. We looked at since 2007, since these first practice-changing trials opened, how the clinical trial participation was. And we found that about 1 in 5 patients, AYA patients, went on trials, which is way higher than the national average of 2%, 1 in 50. So 1 in 4 went on trials. And we also found that if they went on trials, they had a better chance of surviving than if they didn't. And that makes sense. At this time, trials were life-saving. Not going on trials was not. And so because of things like this program, because of interested faculty like Dr. Sondak, Dr. Kushalani, Dr. Stanap, Dr. Erlu, Dr. Messina, I could go on and on. Because they were interested in taking care of the younger patients, because they made sure they went on trials, lives were saved. And I think that's an important message to get across. Clinical trials, when at the cutting edge, absolutely life-saving when they're positive. And so that's been a big thing. So in summary, the pediatrician's perspective, mine at least, I won't say it's for all of us, is that young adults get cancer, adolescents get cancer, children get cancer. In some cases, childhood cancers are the standard of care, and what should happen is that young adults, someone who's just over that limit, someone if the cancer center says we take care of kids up to 21, and a 23-year-old has a cancer, sometimes bringing that pediatric expertise up to that 23-year-old is absolutely the right thing to do. Sometimes there's a trial available at the pediatric center where that's the right thing to do too. But also sometimes, and this is definitely the case in melanoma, having the expertise of adult doctors who take care of adults who only take care of melanoma is absolutely important, I think, in helping to develop a plan for children with cancer. And so what I am not saying is send me an email and I'll tell you the perfect plan. What I'm telling you is children deserve at least as good care as adults. And the standard of care here is to discuss cases in this room in a tumor board. What's it, Wednesday at 11 or noon?
11:30.
11:30. So I knew it was right around there. It's Wednesday at 11:30, where you don't get one opinion, you get a half dozen opinions. You get experts looking at the scans and the pathology, all in the same room, all talking about the same person, talking about what trials, what is the standard of care for an adult, and then trying to figure out for any age group and for any particular set of circumstances, what's the right treatment for the child. We hope that that's a clinical trial, because then we can learn and really understand if that was the right decision going forward. But if it's not, and if the available clinical trials aren't up to speed, then it might be something different. And so that is definitely what we've done with the patients that I've encountered here in the Tampa area. And it's definitely what we've done for some patients who aren't in the Tampa area when they've reached out. And so, so that's my general impression of that. Specific to the young adult population and adolescent population, we have tons of really good community supporters that have brought the necessary fundings for us to address some of give a little bit more bells and whistles and address the extra things that young adults need, namely fertility consultations, which might not be that important in melanoma depending on the therapy, but might. So it would be a case-specific thing. Making sure that we do build bridges so patients in this area can talk to each other. We have monthly dinners that we pay for. Inpatient, we have a lounge. We have every other week we have a lounge night where inpatients get together. But we do try to create bridges across for the patients to talk to each other. And the way we're building the program in this current iteration, the AYA program's been around since 2011. The way we're building it in this current iteration is that we're trying to make sure that we have a navigator reach out to patients before they ever set foot here to give some ideas, demystify things like fertility consultations, like clinical trials, try to see if a social worker is going to be helpful. We think most of the time they would be. Getting people to fertility clinics ahead of time if they need to. And then trusting that Moffitt Care works. Every single patient can go to the right disease-specific care team. And we're working on trying to find the funding to employ a clinical trial coordinator so we can study patients' attitudes and patients' needs on treatment. And then working on the survivorship plan again. So at the end, the last day of treatment, you know, when you ring the bell or when you say there's no more IV infusions or no more of this or no more of that, we want to get patients back to the survivorship clinic. And we want to hire someone there that's going to be a champion to get people right back to where their life was before diagnosis. Getting cancer at any age is life-altering, and it changes prioritizations and it changes all sorts of things, and we want to make sure that people get back to whatever is important to them. If that's changed, that's fine, but just get back to being their maximal self. And again, this is just another kind of concept map for what we're up to in the AYA program, working on, so, you know, this is a fast way to kind of get through the various areas. There are videos attached to this, and we're working on highlighting this in through the web to kind of help patients and providers understand what we're up to in the AYA.